I have a little reading here from The Crock of Gold by James Stevens. Dollar store glasses to the rescue. I'll just read you the first chapter. Chapter 1. In the center of the pine wood called Dorca, there lived, not long ago, two philosophers. They were wiser than anything else in the world except the salmon who lies in the pool of Glen Cagney, into which nuts of knowledge fall from the hazel bush on its bank. He, of course, is the most profound of living creatures, but the two philosophers are next to him in wisdom. Their faces looked as though they were made of parchment. There was ink under their nails, and every difficulty that was submitted to them, even by women, they were able to instantly resolve. The grey woman of Dungorchin and the thin woman of Innis McGrath asked them the three questions which nobody had ever been able to answer, and they were able to answer them. That was how they obtained the enmity of these two women, which is more valuable than the friendship of angels. The grey woman and the thin woman were so incensed at being answered that they married the two philosophers in order to be able to pinch them in bed. But the skins of the philosophers were so thick that they did not know they were being pinched. They repaid the fury of the women with such tender affection that these vicious creatures almost expired of chagrin. And once, in a very ecstasy of exasperation, after having been kissed by their husbands, they uttered the 1,400 maledictions which comprised their wisdom, and these were learned by the philosophers, who thus became even wiser than before. In due process of time, two children were born to these marriages. They were born on the same day, in the same hour, and they were only different in this, that one of them was a boy and the other was a girl. Nobody was able to tell how this had happened, and for the first time in their lives, the philosophers were forced to admire an event which they had been unable to prognosticate, but having proved by many different methods that the children were really children, that what must be, that a fact cannot be controverted, and that what had happened once may happen twice. They described the occurrence as extraordinary but not unnatural, and submitted peacefully to a providence even wiser than they were. The philosopher who had the boy was very pleased because he said there were too many women in the world. And the philosopher who had the girl was very pleased also because he said you cannot have too much of a good thing. The grey woman and the thin woman, however, were not in the least softened by paternity. They said that they had not bargained for it, that the children were gotten under false pretenses, that they were respectable married women, and that as a protest against their wrongs, they would not cook any more food for the philosophers. This was pleasant news for their husbands, who disliked the women's cooking very much, but they did not say so, for the women would certainly have insisted on their rights to cook had they imagined their husbands disliked the result. Therefore, the philosophers besought their wives every day to cook one of their lovely dinners again, and this the women always refused to do. They all lived together in a small house in the very center of a dark pine wood. Into this place the sun never shone, because the shade was too deep, and no wind ever came there either, because the boughs were too thick, so that it was the most solitary and quiet place in the world, and the philosophers were able to hear each other's thinking all day long, or making speeches to each other. And these were the pleasantest sounds they knew of. To them, there were only two kinds of sounds anywhere. These were conversations and noise. They liked the first very much indeed, but they spoke of the second with stern disapproval. And even when it was made by a bird, a breeze, or a shower of rain, they grew angry and demanded that it should be abolished. Their wives seldom spoke at all, and yet they were never silent. They communicated with each other by a kind of physical telegraphy, which they had learned among the sheep. They cracked their finger joints quickly or slowly, and so were able to communicate with each other over immense distances, for by dint of long practice they could make great explosive sounds which were nearly like thunder, and gentler sounds like the tapping of grey ashes on a hearthstone. The thin woman hated her own child, but she loved the grey woman's baby, and the grey woman loved the thin woman's infant, but could not abide her own. A compromise may put an end to the most perplexing of situations, and consequently the two women swapped children, and at once became the most tender and amiable mothers imaginable. And the families were able to live together in a more perfect amity than could be found anywhere else. The children grew in grace and comeliness. At first the little boy was short and fat, and the little girl was long and thin. Then the little girl became round and chubby, while the little boy grew lanky and wiry. This was because the little girl used to sit very quiet and be good, and the little boy used not. They lived for many years in the deep seclusion of the pine wood, wherein a perpetual twilight reigned. And here they were wont to play their childish games, flitting among the shadowy trees like little quick shadows. At times their mothers, the grey woman and the thin woman, played with them, but this was seldom. Sometimes their fathers, the two philosophers, came out and looked at them through spectacles, which were very round and very glassy, and had immense circles of horn all around the edges. They had, however, other playmates with whom they could romp all day long. There were hundreds of rabbits running about in the brushwood. They were full of fun and were very fond of playing with the children. There were squirrels who joined cheerfully in the games, and some goats, having one day strayed in from the big world, were made so welcome that they always came again whenever they got the chance. There were birds also, crows, blackbirds, willy wagtails, who were well acquainted with the youngsters and visited them as frequently as their busy lives permitted. At the short distance from their home, there was a clearing in the wood, about 10 feet square. Through this clearing, as through a funnel, the sun for a few hours in the summertime blazed down. It was the boy who first discovered the strange radiant shaft in the wood. One day he had been sent out to collect pine cones for the fire, and these were gathered daily. The supply immediately near the house was scanty, therefore he had, while searching for more, wandered further from his home than usual. The first sight of the extraordinary blaze astonished him. He had never seen anything like it before, and the steady, unwinking glare aroused his fear and curiosity equally. Curiosity will conquer fear, even more than bravery will. Indeed, it has led many people into dangers which mere physical courage would shudder away from. For hunger and love and curiosity are the three great impelling forces of life. When the little boy found that the light did not move, he drew closer to it, and at last, emboldened by curiosity, he stepped right into it and found it was not a thing at all. The instant he stepped into the light, he found it was hot, and this so frightened him that he jumped out of it again and ran behind a tree. Then he jumped into it for a moment and out of it again, and for nearly a half an hour he played a splendid game of tit and tig with the sunlight. At last he grew quite bold and stood in it and found that it did not burn him at all. But he did not like to remain in it, fearing he might be cooked. When he went home with with the pine cones he said nothing to the grey woman of Dungorchin, or to the thin woman of Innis McGrath, or to the two philosophers, but he told the little girl all about it when they went to bed, and every day afterwards they used to go and play with the sunlight, and the rabbits and the squirrels would follow them there and join in their games with twice the interest they had shown before. And that's merely the beginning of many wonderful adventures. But if you want to know more, you're just going to have to read the book, The Crock of Gold by James Stephens.